Hello scholarly gamers and welcome to another episode of Streaming Fundamentals. Today we're going to talk about codecs and bit rates and why they are important to you as a streamer. This ties in closely with the last two episodes, streaming from console and also streaming software. To be honest, when it comes to codecs as well as encoder settings, if you stream directly from console, those are not applicable to you. All you need to worry about is bitrate. But to put bit rates in a context, I really need to also discuss codecs and encoder settings. So, you know, this is a bit of a mishmash, I'm afraid. If you stream strictly from console, some of this may not really apply to you, but it is important to know what bit rate to choose. So where to begin? Let's just talk about bit rates as a whole, right? I mean, bit rate has to do with bandwidth, and this affects you as a streamer, the broadcaster yourself, as well as your viewers. Because if you stream from console, you might have noticed, you know, whether it's Twitch or YouTube, you can choose the quality setting, and it'll give you an estimate of how many kilobits per second that's going to stream at, right? And it's the same on a PC. If you use an XSplit or OBS, you can adjust these and set them manually to whatever you require. Now, it goes without saying that yes, a higher value is going to result in a better picture quality, and we'll discuss why that is a little bit later. But keep in mind, a higher bit rate is using up more bandwidth. So there's two sides to this story. You as the broadcaster need to make sure you have enough upload speed available. And then likewise, as a viewer, you need to make sure you have enough download speed to be able to view streams, you know, comfortably and, you know, at a good quality level. You don't want your viewers to be constantly buffering. This is something that many people are realizing with Twitch raising its available bit rate all the way up to 6,000 kilobytes per second, or about 6 megabytes. And likewise on Mixer, we can stream all the way up to 10 megabytes, which picture quality is outstanding. It's great, but you know, not everyone has a nice, reliable internet connection, so it can affect your viewers. You need to find this balance. Before you worry about trying to actually understand that fine balance, you first need to see what your internet is actually capable of. For example, I ran a speed test just here a few moments ago, and keep in mind, look, I'm over in Scotland. Our internet is very regional, and I've basically got the fastest that is available in my area. Unfortunately, if I was in a big metropolitan area, I'd have an amazing download and an amazing upload, but hey, I've got the best that I can. So for my area, I've got a download speed of 74.2 megabytes per second, and an upload speed of 17.7, right? So to view, I've got no issues. I can watch whatever I want for the most part. And to stream, likewise, I've got quite a lot of bandwidth there. Now, this is where it's important for you to do a speed test. You know, use whatever site you want, but you need to figure out what your upload is, because then you're going to need to use a little bit of math. I highly recommend never going over 75% of what your upload speed is, right? That allows you to have 25% of leeway. So in my case, that works out to 13.2 megabytes per second. If you're using kilobytes per second, that would show up as 1,300, right? So I'm not going to stream at that, right? We know that that's going to be too high for any of the services to support. But at least I know, hey, I have a bit of leeway here. I can go relatively high. So that's good to know. But keep in mind, you know, if you've got an upload speed of only 2 megabytes per second or 2,000 kilobytes, then you're not going to be able to stream any more than at 1,500. So this is what you need to look at. You need to make sure that, you know, you have the necessary bandwidth available to you. A very common bit rate that people have streamed at in the past that I've always seen was 3,500 kilobytes per second, which that's great. You know, you need to make sure you have that little bit of overhead though, that, you know, an additional 3500 needs to only make up 75%. You know, so to play it on the safe side, I suppose you'd really want to have an upload speed of 5 megabytes. You know, so that's just a case of trying to decide of what you have available, and then you can choose your bit rate. And not all bit rates are created equal, right? I mean, depending on how high you have it, bit rate's a funny one. Bit rate directly affects your image quality, because the bit rate is the approximate amount of you know, kilobytes per second that the codec will try to produce, right? It's taking whatever your source is, and it's encoding it to send it out over the internet. You know, it's not an exact science, unfortunately. If you have XSplit or OBS, you know you have the choice between variable bitrate or constant bitrate. Now, for streaming, it is always recommended to use constant bitrate, but unfortunately, it isn't actually 100% constant, and there's fluctuation. And so this is why it's important you have that 25% of headroom above what you set your bitrate at, because that way, if you've set it at 2500, it should stay in that range, but occasionally it will kind of, you know, go under that, but it will also spike above. And occasionally, you know, it can spike. It's usually not a crazy amount, but it can indeed be quite a fair bit, which if you've left a really, really small tolerance or no headroom whatsoever, that's going to affect your stream. That's going to result in dropped frames. That's going to result in your viewers being mad and irritated and not getting a great experience. You know, so it's something to be mindful of, right? So I wanted to give you that little idea of bit rates, and we're going to compare bit rates later on. I've got a whole bunch of video footage, of game footage basically recorded at different bit rates, just so you can see the differences. Now, the disclaimer is, obviously this is on YouTube, so this entire video has been transcoded yet again, so you might not get the full effect or be able to see you know, the clear differences that I can see looking at the raw videos. I just hope that it at least displays somewhat of a difference that you can visibly see, but we'll find out soon enough. To give you an idea of kind of the values that are required to watch video content, right? I mean, for example, 4K content, which is at a standard frame rate, you know, like movies or whatever, which are at either 24 frames per second, 25 frames per second, or 30 frames per second. To watch something in 4K, currently, you need between 35 and 45 megabytes per second, right? So yeah, my download speed, I can handle that, but there's no way I could upload a 4K, right? Similarly with 2K, which is 1440p, that requires about 16 megabytes per second. So see, for me to stream at 1440, I don't have enough headroom to do that. But then as you drop down, depending on the frame rates, you know, 1080p requires somewhere between 8 and 12 megabytes for perfect visual acuity, you know, to actually be what we call lossless. Because unfortunately, in the encoding process, you lose some of the visual quality. And as you go down and further, you know, 720p is, for low frame rates, is going to look perfect at 5 megabytes per second, and for high frame rates is more around 7.5. Again, most of us don't stream at those levels. We stream lower, and this is why codecs are important. If you're streaming from PC and using XSplit or OBS, you will be so used to having a couple of options depending on your hardware configuration. If you have a NVIDIA video card, you'll have the NVENC as an option, which is NVIDIA's own encoding process. This allows you to use your video card to do the encoding work. Your CPU doesn't use any of its power, and you know, it's a nice decent way to do things. Unfortunately, in the past, NVENC was great for recording but not for streaming, because it requires a really high bitrate to look good. Again, we'll look at the video footage later and you can be the judge yourself. It is more common for streamers who are streaming from a PC to use the processor option, which is X264. Now, X264 is, you know, it's a software codec, but it's using your CPU, if that makes sense. Your CPU is doing the work, it's encoding it and sending it out, and depending on what kind of processor you have, this may or may not work well for you. I used to have an AMD quad core, and it just couldn't handle it very well. I had to have a really low bitrate, low quality settings, and it just didn't look very good at all. But once I upgraded to an i7 from Intel, I was able to stream no problems. Now, I'm not saying you need to go out and buy the best, fastest processor. Indeed, at a later episode, we'll talk about hardware. But it's just to be mindful of, depending on what you have, one of these options is going to be better for you. So OBS and XSplit, or whatever software you use, tends to have these options. If you have an AMD video card, I believe they use what's called VCE, which is AMD's version of NVENC, the format that NVIDIA uses. And I don't have any recent experience with that. I know years ago when I was running AMD cards, I was not very pleased with the video quality whatsoever. But hey, we're in a new generation of AMD cards. Hopefully things are better these days. Both of these codecs, whether you're using your video card or your CPU, are basically using the 264 format. That is what we're stuck with at the moment. 264 is kind of an old technology, and it's not built for 4K, if we're honest. Remember when I just told you there that 4K content requires almost 50 megabytes per second to watch? That's because of the codec. It's limited by 264. Now, what's on the horizon is the 265 codec, which currently, as far as I know, we don't have available to us in XSplit or OBS, but hopefully that'll be a little bit later down the line. H265 is much more efficient. I've got an image here briefly that shows a comparison between file size. So this was a basketball drive, an image, right? And when it's encoded using 264, it has a file size of 30 megabytes, whereas when it's encoded with H265, it has a size of 17 megabytes. Now that's important because that also translates to streaming. Can you imagine being able to stream using half the amount of bandwidth but getting the same visual quality? This is going to be a big deal. So if you think about those 4K numbers of requiring 50 megabytes per second, once 265 is, you know, more mainstream, it brings that down to about 25. And it's likewise when we get into streaming. If we get 265 available to us, we'll be able to stream at higher resolutions. Because currently everyone would love to stream at 1080p, and I'm sure all the viewers would love to watch 1080p broadcasts, but the bit rate that's required to do that is just too high to practically be used. So yes, what is going to work better for you is honestly going to depend on your system. So in the meantime, why don't we actually look at some of the results here. So right now they've got the steep Road to the Olympics open beta is available, and I thought, you know what, this is the perfect chance to do comparisons. I went to the Winter Park, which is basically like a ski jump but with a snowboard. You got 3 runs, you have to, you know, just do the one trick each time. It takes your 3 scores, and you know, you can see if you place. I thought that would be a great kind of benchmark to use. Yes, I'm not doing the exact same trick every time. Sometimes I fall, but I thought this would serve as a good kind of benchmark to use so you can gauge the visual differences. Again, I'm not sure if we're going to see much of a difference because, again, I'm having to render this video, upload it to YouTube, so it might change it even more. But so first up, I went with 720p at 30 frames per second, using the X264, so using my processor, with only a 1500 bit rate. Now it's also worth noting In the encoder settings, I am using the very fast option. Very fast is the default setting that most softwares do indeed come with. Now, this is a very important setting because this, depending on what you read, some people will tell you that it doesn't make much of a difference. Whereas what I have noticed in my testing is that one setting has one of the biggest differences aside from bitrate, right? Bitrate's always number one. That's going to make your biggest difference in visual quality. But the encoder setting is the next in line. Very fast, looks fine, it's great, quite a light processor load, but you can then, you can up it, right? So it goes from very fast to faster to fast to medium to slow, right? So this is the speed at which the encoding is actually happening. What that means is the amount of compression that is used for your video source. The slower speeds are going to look amazing, but they're going to crunch into your processing power. For example, when I went from streaming at very fast, I was only using about 30% or so of my CPU, right? So plenty of overhead there, no problems whatsoever. But by going all the way to medium, my CPU usage jumped all the way up to about 80, peaking I believe at 87%. And that was just straight capturing from an Elgato capture card Xbox footage. That wasn't using the PC, that wasn't using a webcam, microphone, so this is one of the problems with your encoder settings. You're gonna have to strike a balance between quality and performance, but that's something you can tweak after you get your bandwidth, your bitrate set correctly. So again, this first video is 720p 30 frames per second using the X264 software codec, a bitrate of 1500 and at very fast. Now as you can see, this is the kind of baseline, the low end of the visual quality. This is if you don't have a good enough internet speed, you don't have maybe the fastest of processors in your home rig, and this is the best that you can do for now, right? So this gives you an idea. Next, all the settings are the same, but this footage here is with a bitrate of 2500. As you can see, there isn't too much of a difference. There's a slight difference. It might help if I can just pull them up side by side quickly, right, for a little bit of a comparison. Again, I'm not sure if you'll be able to really tell the difference, but there is a difference. You can see it, believe me, when you look at the raw video. Next up is again all the same settings, but this time the bitrate has been up to 3500. I use 3500 kilobytes per second because this is one of the most common bit rates that people choose. It's a very nice medium between visual quality, kind of average upload speed, and we tend to think that most viewers are going to be able to watch at 3500, or at least you would hope so. For those of you that live in really rural areas that have horrible internet, I feel sorry for you. I'm sorry. What can we say? But 3500 is about the average. So again, you can kind of see it's slightly better. And then lastly, for the 720p results, well, using the X264, this is at 6000 kilobytes per second. So as you can see, things look better. There's less artifacting. Again, we're only streaming still at 30 frames per second, but this bit rate is probably a bit unrealistic. If you were streaming at 720, 30 frames, you probably wouldn't be streaming all the way up at 6000. You'd probably be, using a 60 FPS setup, or possibly even a higher resolution. And to end this little bit right here, let's just put all four together side by side to see if you can actually see a difference or not. Again, I don't know if you will be able to see at home because this is YouTube, but we'll find out. Right, so that's using your CPU, right? Again, that was using the very fast preset, so it was only using about 30% CPU power. Next up is using NVIDIA's encoder, NVENC, right? So this has no impact on CPU performance whatsoever. It's just using the video card. And I'm using all the same settings, 720p, 30 frames per second, and first up is at a bitrate of 1500. As you can see, this doesn't look good. It really does not look good at all. And this is one of the problems with NVENC, is at the lower bitrate scale, it doesn't do it justice. For recording locally, when you don't have to limit your bitrate, it's outstanding. You get really good visual quality, no kinds of issues that I've noticed, and just for recording, I think NVENC's really, really good. But at this low bitrate for streaming, it's potato quality, let's be honest. Next up is using NVENC at 2500 kilobytes per second. As you can see, there's a slight improvement, probably not much, but it is there. If we move on very quickly to 3500 kilobytes per second, again, using that number because that seems to be the average that people choose. And unfortunately on NVENC, I don't believe it looks as good as the X264. Let's see if we can pull those up side by side briefly. Indeed we can. Okay, I'm not sure if it's hard to gauge, but I believe, you know, it's because of the encoding on the YouTube video raw that they're definitely, the X264 looks better than the NVENC. And lastly, we've got NVENC at 6000 kilobytes per second. Again, using this number because currently on Twitch, this is the max you can go to. Keep in mind on Mixer, you can go higher. It used to be a limit of 10, I believe they've lowered it down to 9. At 6000, it's looking decent. It looks okay. It's not horrible, but it's still, I don't believe 6000 kilobytes per second is still enough for the NVENC to really shine. Right, so let's take it up a notch, right? Let's go up to 1080p at 60 frames per second. Now, I'm not even going to bother with the lower settings of 1500, 2500. There's just no point, not at 1080p and 60 FPS. It would look like absolute garbage. So instead, let's look at 3500 kilobytes per second. Now again, this is using the very fast preset for the encoder. So as you can see, 3500 just isn't enough for a 1080p at 60 FPS broadcast. It's okay, but it's, you know, if you're limited to 3500, you're going to be better off going down to 720p, 30 or maybe 60, depending on what your system can handle, but changing the encoder option, changing the encoder from very fast to a higher setting. In fact, if we look right now, this next one is going to be 1080p 60 frames per second, still using X264, still at 3500 kilobytes per second, but using the medium preset. Let's see if I can pull those side by side briefly. Right, you can see the difference there. Again, 3500 still isn't enough for 1080p, but using the medium encoder setting does help. While on the other hand, if we look at this next clip, this is 1080p 60 frames per second, all the same settings, using the very fast encoder preset, but this time at a bit rate of 6000 kilobytes per second. In my opinion, this still isn't high enough for 1080p, but it does look considerably better than 3500 kilobytes per second. And lastly, the last two videos to look at are using the NVENC encoder, the NVIDIA built-in one for that uses your GPU instead of your CPU. Again, these are at 1080p, both at 60 frames per second, but this first one is using a bitrate of 3500, which, again, as you can see, looks okay. It's not bad. It's not, well, I say it's not bad, let's be honest, it's not great, is it? You wouldn't be happy if this is what your broadcast looks like, and likewise as a viewer you probably wouldn't be happy tuning into something of this quality unless you're on mobile. It might actually look halfway decent. And then lastly is now using a bitrate of 6000 kilobytes per second. So yes, it's an improvement, but again, for 1080p it still just isn't quite high enough, right? So let's do a little comparison of some of the highs and the lows. So if we take all of the 6,000 bitrate videos and put them together, the top left is using the X264, the top right is using the NVIDIA NVENC, right? Both of those are at 720p 30 frames per second with a bit rate of 6,000. Bottom left is using the X264 using your CPU, but at 1080p 60 frames per second. And in the bottom right is 1080p 60 frames per second using the NVENC at a 6,000 kilobyte per second bit rate. Right, so hopefully that gives you a decent comparison. Again, apologies if after the video has been compressed via YouTube, if the differences aren't as clear as they are to me looking at the raw files. I greatly apologize for that. But you know, basically there's a big difference. You really don't want to use NVENC unless you absolutely have to, in my opinion. I think it's fine for recording when you're not limited to your bitrate, but when it comes to streaming, look, you really need to use your CPU. Unless you don't care about using as high a bitrate as you can. If you're on Mixer, for example, and want to hover around that 9K mark, that's fine. Just keep in mind that a lot of your viewers won't be able to tune in. Now, indeed, if you go to Twitch, if you go to stream.twitch.tv/encoding, Twitch has its own guidelines. These are not hard, fast rules. These are just guidelines. So it lets you know that, look, for a 720p 60 frames per second experience, the bitrate is going to be best between 3500 to 5000. Whereas for 720p at 30 frames per second, somewhere between 2500 to 4. This area is where I think most streamers, most broadcasters are going to be living in. Whereas for 1080p, they claim that for 60 frames per second, you should be able to stream using 4500 to 6000. Yes, you probably could, but you're going to have to ramp up that encoder preset to make up for the lower bit rate. And then likewise for 1080p 30 frames per second, they're saying 3500 to 5000. But yes, encoder presets do make a hell of a difference on PC, but you should leave that until you get your bit rate sorted. If your viewers are telling you that they're getting a lot of buffering, that they're getting a lot of drop frames, or likewise on your PC, you can see what looks like frames are being dropped, you know, whether it's your broadcasting software letting you know, or if it's your stream statistics, depending on what service you use. If you're dropping frames, there's a good chance it's bitrate related, or possibly even the ingest server. So that's why I recommend doing that speed test. See what your absolute cap is of your upload speed. Do some math, figure out what 75% of that is, and you don't want to go over that. If you have really poor internet, unfortunately, that might limit what you're able to stream at when it comes to your upload speed. Once you've got that nailed down, you've got your bitrate set exactly where you want it, now you can start playing with your encoder preset. Again, most software by default comes set at very fast. So if you're noticing that you're only using up 30% of your CPU, then why not crank that up a notch? Only do one step at a time though, because you want to see how badly it's going to affect things. Keep in mind too, a lot is going to vary depending on whether you're playing a game on your actual PC that you're streaming from, or if you're playing from, you know, a console and using a capture card. If you're console gaming, you're going to have a lot more headroom, whereas if you're streaming from a PC and playing on that PC, you're going to have less available processing power at your disposal. So just play with that. What you want to ensure you don't do is to have your processor pegging out at 100%. Even if it's hovering to 90, I think that's as far as you want to go, because you need to have a little bit of leeway. Just think about it. You've got your stream set up, you've got the bitrate set how you want it, you've got the encoder set as high as it can go, and your CPU's right around 90-95%, just sitting there playing a game, right? Then all of a sudden you get a follower subscription, you know, a follower message notification, a subscription notification. Maybe you get raided and your chat logs just starts blowing up, right? You've got no leeway for your CPU. What is going to happen? You're going to drop frames. The stream might even just crap out and disconnect. So be mindful of that. I don't have a hard number of what you want to do. You know, should I aim for 80% usage? Should I aim for 75? Again, you're just going to have to gauge that on your own. Because keep in mind, things like overlays, cameras, chroma, your microphone, all of these other components are going to be taking up processing power as well. And you want to make sure you have a little bit of headroom rather than being pegged the entire time. Now, that's really about it when it comes to codecs and bit rates and why are they important. But please, I urge you, if you want to know more, get out there and look at this stuff. You'll see so many recommendations from so many different people, and the truth is there is no hard use this for that and, you know, this setting if you have this type of computer. It's really about discovering what works for you and will vary on your software as well. Now, for those of you that use XSplit, a little birdie's told me that the next version of XSplit is about to come out, the broadcaster, which is going to finally be a 64-bit version. And allegedly the 64-bit version uses a heck of a lot less processing power than the 32-bit. Because I know a lot of people out there claim that they have issues with XSplit because it uses more processing power than OBS. That wasn't my experience, but you know, I have seen it. I have seen people with that issue. So that's just something to be mindful of as well. You know, once software gets updated, you'll be able to maybe play around a little bit more and make even more changes to your settings. But yeah, it's, you know, get out there, have a look, see what you can find. If you happen to go, I don't think it's been updated. The Mixer forums are having issues, but I had a thread way back in February of this year talking about bit rates and codecs, and it was a great discussion with other community members, basically looking at some of our results, streaming and recording with different codecs and different bit rates. But there's similar threads like that on Reddit and other places. Again, hey, thank you for watching Streaming Fundamentals. We will see you next time, for we will be talking about PC hardware, right? What are some things to look at? What is, you know, what do you actually need? Can you just grab your old laptop that your granny doesn't use anymore and hope to stream from that? Or do you need to spend thousands on a crazy Threadripper processor with 16 cores and 32 threads? Maybe you don't even know what that means, right? We'll discuss hardware, specifically PC hardware, next time on Streaming Fundamentals. In the meantime, take care. I'll catch you later.